Remember to Grow a Garden by S.J. Fine. She was 13 when he came to her village, the youngest of 6. She was out carefully placing the wet clothes on the bushes and tall grasses to dry. She noticed him as he walked down the dirt road. He was carrying a satchel and stirring the dirt up. The cloud that formed encircled him as he trudged down the road. There had been no rain for weeks, and the road was soft with the red soil. It floated over everything in sight, including herself. She clucked her tongue at him as she saw the particles that float to her clean clothes. Then she noticed him turn up the track to her house. Who was this stranger? She was suddenly uneasy and ran into the house calling, "Mama, Mama." "What is it, child? What's the matter?" the middle-aged woman asked. "A man. He is coming here," the breathless girl eked out. "Who is he? Que quería?" "Well, this is not a thing to be concerned with. Your papa will see to it. Are you finished con la ropa?" "Sí, Mama, I'm finished." She slipped back out the door and around to the backyard. She dumped the heavy laundry tub, being careful to get every drop of water on her meager garden. The suds coated the leaves of the tomatillo plants, and she smiled at the thought of salsa verde in the fall. She hung the tub on the side of the house to dry. The rusted nail stood as a lonely icon, and stood the washboard next to it to dry as well. She stared at both items, so convenient and so new. Never had she thought the chore would be so easy. No more lugging the soiled clothes to the creek, no more aching back, no more scraped knuckles. These newfangled washing tools were a marvel. She had her papa to thank. Then she remembered the stranger and had just begun to think about who he might be when she heard her papa call to her, "Lupita, vien para acá." "Sí, papa, ya vengo," she replied and hurried to the house. Her mother was no longer in the kitchen, and she wondered where she was. She straightened her skirt and brushed at her hair and walked into the living area. She saw her father, tall, proud, and dark-skinned, sitting near a shorter and much darker man. They appeared to be the same age. They both stood when she walked in. Her mother was nowhere in sight. "Sí, papa, usted llámame?" "Sí, sí, mija," he paused and turned to his guest. "Guadalupe Valenzuela, mi hija." He turned back to Lupe. "Y eso es mi amigo de España, Señor Julián de la Cruz." He patted his friend on the back. They obviously enjoyed one another. "Mucho gusto a conocerlo, señor." She was beginning to wonder where her mother was. She noticed their coffee cups were almost empty, and she caught them up to fill them. She turned and, excusing herself, re-entered the kitchen. The men smiled at her service. She stepped out the door, having noticed the wood was all but gone. Where had her mother gone, and what could cause her to let the fire go out? She chose the wood carefully, making sure it was not going to smoke up the place. Then she brought it in and blew on the few embers that were left. Soon the blaze was back, and she bent to lift the old iron grate. It smeared her hands with black, greasy soot, and she hastily dropped it over the now blazing fire, sending sparks all around the floor. She stood looking at the mess, hands on hips, shaking her head. More work. She still wished for a proper wood stove, like the shiny one the Tarascas down the road had. She sighed. Still, it is better than the old fireplace outside. She smiled. Now they only used that when it was el tiempo para tamales. She placed the coffee beans in the molcajete and set to grinding them down, enough that it would release the pungent flavor. She smiled at the black rock in her hand, now covered in coffee bits. Her mother had proudly brought it home and displayed it on the mantel that held prized possessions. She remembered her mother explaining that it would make much quicker work than the old wooden mortar they always had used to crack the corn down, or the spices they used every day. She hoped one day she too would own such a beautiful molcajete. Then, shaking herself from her revelry, she whisked all the coffee leavings into the old pot and poured water over them from the large kettle by the door. She left it to boil and went in search of her mother. She found her in the bedroom. "Mamá, ¿qué pasó?" She stood bewildered at her mother's tears. "¿Has conocido a él?" her mother whispered. "Sí, lo conoce. ¿Por qué?" Lupe was confused. "¿Quién es?" She pressed her mother to tell her. "Él es tu esposo. Tu esposo." She began to cry, and Lupe, stunned, stumbled to the kitchen to see to the coffee. The words esposo resounding in her head. How could it be? Her father wouldn't do this to her. No, her mother must be mistaken. She very shakily took the coffee to the men, turned, and without making eye contact with either, went back into the kitchen. The men soon took their cups and went into the office, which was no more than an outside shed that had been attached to the living area. It offered some semblance of privacy. Soon Lupita was joined by her mother in the kitchen. Mama, why do you say he is my husband? Lupita's dark eyes began to water. Her mother, Petra, wringing her hands and walking to her daughter, replied, Your father, Lupe, she caressed her face. Your father is always looking out for you. He wants the best for you, you know. She smiled a crooked smile. He has been speaking of this man, this hombre, who has an excellent name and business prospects in los Estados Unidos, mija. She paused. Lupita pleaded, but Mama, he's old, viejo. She looked down, letting the tears fall where they would. I don't want to marry him. She shook in her place. He will make you a good home, was all her mother could say in response. It was unclear whether she said it for her daughter's sake or her own. It had the same effect. Comida, por favor, mucha comida para la celebración, was heard from the other room. Mama, please, I don't want to marry him. Oh, hija, ¿no entiendes? Tú no tenías elección. Entonces, vamos a preparar la comida. Days passed, and still the man stayed on. He and Papa spent hours together in the den, calling out orders for café or comida or postre or un poquito pastel. It was infuriating. How long, Mama? How long will he be here? Lupita would groan out every now and again. She would reply, Recuerdes, cuando él va, tú vas también. Ay, Mama, and she would continue with her work. Cuando calienta el sol, aquí en la tierra, quiero hacer mi jardín. The two were inseparable, not knowing how long before Lupita had to leave. Lupe was secretly glorying in the fact that her father had not mentioned marriage to her at all. Maybe her mother had misunderstood. Claro, that was it. She had simply misunderstood. Of course her papa wouldn't expect her to marry that old man, round as he was, and viejo. Bright and early the following day, Lupita tended the garden. She was careful with the rows of corn, getting the weeds from around each stalk. She was proud of the stalks. They were reaching for the sky and getting closer each day. The tomatillos were so green, and the yellow blossoms were fading, giving way to the small lantern-like husks. She knew each one concealed a tiny green tomato. She ran her hand over the row of cebollas, their tall green tops so aromatic and soft. She stood, rubbing her lower back and lifting her face to the sun. How good it felt. And even though it browned her skin, she still embraced it. And as she walked to the chicken coop, she heard voices. She threw the weeds over the fence, watching the hens cluck and dart to be the first to get them. And then she heard her name, not her nickname, but her full legal name. She crept closer to the corner of the coop and leaned around just a bit. That's when she saw them. Mama and Papa arguing. Never had she seen her mother so outspoken, so angry. Her face was flushed, her nostrils flaring, and her hands were going so fast, emphasizing each word in the air. Papa also was animated. She knew she shouldn't listen, but she wanted to. She had a right to know her own fate, didn't she? But then, alarmed at what she might hear, she ran off in the opposite direction. She didn't want to know, didn't want to hear. She wanted nothing more than to live in utter ignorance. She ran blindly, wordlessly, panting from anxiety brought on by her parents' fighting and her own stupidity. She ran straight into the man she now despised, the man she blamed for taking her away from her family, the man, this man, her soon-to-be husband. He held on to her tightly at the shoulders and tried to quiet her. He stared at her, squinting and turning his head from side to side as if he were removing a cactus spike from his foot. Perdóname, señor, perdóname, por favor. She was horrified that she had landed right where she didn't want to be. Estás bien, was all he said. He released her, and she stumbled on, not quite hearing what he said. Hasta mañana, mi esposa. He walked to the field humming quietly, his hands clasped behind his back. Rafael and Petra walked to the house, she ignoring him, chin up and arms crossed in front of her. He stepped to the side of her, swinging his arms and keeping a few paces in front. They both saw Dela Cruz staring off into the sunset and shook their heads. Send Guadalupe to me at once, he said as he walked through the door and headed to the office. She only sniffed loudly and followed him in. Lupe, ¿dónde estás? Petra called. Aquí estoy, mamá. She walked in quietly, eyes red and puffy. Tu papá quiere hablar contigo en la oficina. She touched her daughter's face. Va. Guadalupe walked straight to the den, ducked her head, and went in. She saw her father sitting on the edge of the chair. She said nothing, only watched him. He soon rose and walked to her. I have agreed to marry you to my friend. He will be good to you. You will not go hungry. There were tears in his eyes, and that signaled a cascade of them to tumble from her own. She flew into his arms, hugging him and begging, pleading for him to change his mind. She could tell from the stiffening of his body, his intake of breath and his pulling away, that he hadn't changed his mind and wouldn't be at all. Pack your things. You leave in the morning, is all he said. She numbly nodded her head. She walked stiffly to the door, looking back at him only to see his back to her. She continued on past the kitchen into her corner of the room. Her mother had left a satchel on her cot. In it were a few embroidered cloths and a small package, wrapped in a frayed cloth. She chose to not open it. Then she saw it, the black shiny rock, tucked inside the perfect rocky bowl, her mother's molcajete. She let her heart soar for only a moment, for she knew it meant this was really happening. She turned her back on the bed and opened the nearby chest. In it were all her prized possessions, her dolls, her books, some rocks, and her most cherished, her quilt that her abuelita had made for her. How could she leave these things? She knew the answer. She wouldn't. She would insist he take them as well. She began to cry. Tears flooded her eyes and blurred everything. She sat on the bed and tried to control the flow. Soon she heard footsteps and knew it was her mother. She stood, turning her back to the entrance. She looked up at the sagging ceiling, the dirt floor, the walls lined with scraps of paper. She smiled at the drawings she had made when she was small. Her cot was precious to her, and now she would never see them again, never see the desk her papa made her out of old pallets from when they built the chicken coop. She had wanted to keep it forever. She had helped him with the building of it. She had saved her treasures from her walks in the tiny drawer he had made, especially for her. It had a wooden knob that she had made. She was proud of it. And now, quien sabe, who knew? She felt her mother's presence. The smell of her was comforting. She turned and fell into her mother's arms. This type of emotion was rarely shown, and she knew her mother's love was sure. She pulled back and smiled. Her mother spoke quietly. ¿Estás lista, mija? Sí, mamá, soy listo. Entonces, vamos. Her mother stood up, straighter than she had stood in many days. She put her chin up and ran her fingers through her hair. She carried herself with pride. No one would see her broken heart. She led her daughter to the outer room. The smoke from the kitchen fire was hovering like an omen over the entire surface of the ceiling. She knew the house was going to seem so quiet without her daughter's laughter and conversation. But she stood, tall and proud. Julian de la Cruz stood waiting. He beamed when he saw Guadalupe. He came over to her, pulling her into an embrace, and vowed to take care of her. He would be kind and generous. He did not wait for a response. He turned to his friend, her father, and hugged him. "Do not worry, my friend. She will have all she needs." "Not her mother," mumbled Petra, barely moving her mouth. She looked at her husband. His face was somber. "So you feel it too, esposo?" she whispered. He nodded tersely. "And your things, Guadalupe, they are packed?" He spoke quietly to her. "See, they are ready." She looked at him. "Who will carry them for us?" "I have a truck hired. He will be here shortly." He nodded to each and stepped outside to give them some privacy. He knew goodbyes were not easy. Lupe turned to her parents. She tried to be proud and brave like her mother, but she couldn't hold the tears back. She went to her father first, hugged him tightly, and whispered, "I know you are doing this for my good, but I will miss you dearly." He kissed her cheeks and her forehead. "Vaya con Dios, mija." She looked at her mother. "I don't know if I am ready for, in marriage." She blushed, wishing she had spoken of this before. "He has agreed to give you time to be ready, maybe a year or two." Her mother encouraged her with these words. Lupita sighed with relief. She hugged and kissed her mother, promising to write soon, and ran out the door. "Recuerdas, mija, ser amable y crecer un jardín." Be kind and grow a garden. These words were to stay with her the rest of her life.